Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and this time we are talking about how Nintendo just revealed more about their Switch 2 2025 lineup. And this is a peculiar situation because we just got their financial results briefing, they put out their explanatory material, and in there are some details that seem to be giving us a better understanding of exactly how Nintendo is going to be putting together their 2025 lineup. However, Nintendo is now hiding some details from that I don't think anyone else has realized yet, so we'll be discussing that today and what it may or may not mean, while also trying to piece together Nintendo's exact lineup for this year, considering everything that we've known and heard. But then on top of all of that, we have another interesting update on Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, which we'll be touching on today as well. But before going forward, let me take this moment to point out that I am aiming to reach 50,000 subscribers by the time the Switch 2 launches on June 5th, so if you find yourself enjoying my content, your subscription would be appreciated. So today, Nintendo put out an interesting update for Prime 4 on the Nintendo Today app. It is a clip of footage from the opening that we saw during the Treehouse segment, but the big deal about this is that we now have the footage and the audio no longer obscured in any way by the Treehouse segment. So I'm going to go ahead and play out this little bit of footage here so you can listen to it and hear the beautiful audio of Prime 4 without interruption. And then there's also the awesome footage as well. And I just gotta say that it sounds amazing. There's so much detail, there's so much nuance to what we're hearing in Prime 4. I definitely get really strong vibes that Retro Studios knows exactly what they're doing here with the music for Prime 4, and I do have myself thinking that this is going to be one of the more powerful scores we're going to get this year from any game, and it does help to strengthen my belief that Prime 4 might be in contention for some serious, significant Game of the Year awards, especially with something like Grand Theft Auto not coming out until next year. But let's now dive into this mystery having to do with Nintendo's 2025 lineup. What nuggets has Nintendo provided to us that can give us a little bit of a better understanding of what is going on? So during Nintendo's Q&A, Nintendo said this about their expectation for software sales this year. In addition, the expected sales volume of the Nintendo Switch 2 software is 45 million units, but this number does not include the number of copies of Mario Kart World that will be included in the Switch 2 Mario Kart World set. Therefore, if we compare including the software that will be included with the hardware, this is expected to exceed the approximately 52 million units of software sold in the 10 months since the launch of Nintendo Switch. In addition, the expected software sales figures were set taking into consideration the fact that there are a greater selection of titles from software publishers compared to when the Nintendo Switch was released, as well as the existence of the Nintendo Switch 2 edition. For this fiscal year, we will strive to exceed our earnings forecast by strengthening our production system and focusing on sales promotion in order to meet the current high demand while aiming for the target sales volume we have set. Of course, the momentum immediately after the launch of Nintendo Switch 2 was important, but we believe that the first hurdle will be how to sustain that momentum and carry it over into the year-end sales season. So here Nintendo is talking about how they're actually aiming to exceed the amount of software sold in a longer span of time than the Switch 1 did back in 2017. Switch 1 came out March 3rd, 2017, so between most of the month of March all throughout the rest of the year until the end of December, 10 whole months, they sold approximately 52 million pieces of software, and here Nintendo's indicating to us that they envision that Switch 2, in a shorter span of time from June 5th, so most of June all the way up until the end of December, 7 months, so 3 months less, they believe they can actually surpass that number. Now what's interesting about the 45 million that they're anticipating to sell here in terms of software does not include the Mario Kart World sales that will be in the bundle, and since they're saying that they're planning to exceed 52 million, then that sort of indicates that they are planning to sell at least 7 million of Mario Kart World in the bundle, but I envision it may be even more than that. If they are anticipating on selling 15 million Switch 2s at least, I'm pretty sure more than half the people buying the Switch 2 are going to be buying a Mario Kart World bundle, so they are actually thinking that they're going to go well beyond the 52 if you consider that. But something else to throw out there is that apparently the digital versions of Switch 2 editions do not count towards their overall software forecast for Switch 2 sales. So that's all very interesting. But they also talk about how they want to sustain that momentum and carry it over into the year-end sales season. And so I think this is actually a pretty big deal when you consider what we know about this year's lineup. And from Nintendo, this is this year's lineup. We have Mario Kart in June, also Welcome Tour, Donkey Kong in July, Kirby Air Riders later into the year. Here are some Switch 2 edition games, and Pokemon and Prime Force certainly big deals, but they are Switch 2 edition games, not Switch 2 exclusives. As I've been talking about for a while, I expect that there will be more announcements during the next Nintendo Direct that we anticipate will be in later June, a few weeks removed from the launch of Switch 2, and there we'll learn about a few more significant games that could be coming out this year. And I'll touch on some of those possibilities a little bit later on into the video. There are a few other things going on here that are very peculiar. So in yesterday's video I talked about a variety of things, the Switch 2 specs leaks. We have this new leak for Donkey Kong Bonanza, so if you want to check out that video, it was yesterday. But later on into the video I also brought up a little bit of the things that came out during Nintendo's financial briefing, and they here had listed Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment for a winter 2025 release. Now this is a big deal because beforehand Nintendo just told us that Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment is coming out just in winter, not necessarily 2025. So this comes with the implication that this game would be coming out, I would assume, this December, because this December is winter and still in 2025. If it's not winter 2025 and just like a blanket winter, it could possibly come out in January or February. But something strange happened today. Nintendo updated their explanatory material. They have changed it. That's why I showed you what I showed you yesterday. They took out the 2025 from the Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment sort of graphic here. So for some reason, Nintendo has taken this down. They are hiding that Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment is going to come out winter of 2025. Now, there are two possibilities here. One, Nintendo is planning to release Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment in this year of 2025, but they did not intend on revealing this timing yet. This may have been an update that we were supposed to have gotten in a June Nintendo Direct. The other possibility is that this game is not going to be coming out in this year of 2025. And perhaps once this got out there and people like me were talking about, hey, looks like Hyrule Warriors is going to make it out this year, Nintendo or Koei Tecmo got word and said, well, we might need to change that because we're not totally sure. And maybe that's a third possibility here. It's still up for debate. It might be coming on this year of 2025, but it's not a certainty yet, and they do not want to clarify on that quite yet. And I suppose a fourth possibility is that it was just straight up a mistake because they were listing all of these 2025 releases. They kept doing 2025, 2025, 2025, and then they just put 2025 here again. But then they made sure to clarify that Dustblogs is 2026 and that Hades 2 is also just to be determined. So I don't know. It's definitely a real strange question mark here. Mistakes like this are uncommon. I'm leaning in the direction that maybe this game does make it out this year. We shall see on that. But there's a little bit more to take away from what's been going on. As we take a look here, they are still saying that Pokemon Legends ZA is a late 2025 release, but next to it we also have Prime 4 as just a 2025 release. And this entire graphic is focused on telling us about Switch 1 releases. Now notice Pokemon Champions is still TBD, to be determined. I would assume that this release is probably coming out next year, because if it was coming out this year, we'd probably know about it already. But I do find this bullet here, they say, to be interesting. Going forward, we will continue to bring out new titles for the over 100 million people worldwide who are playing Nintendo Switch. And what this tells us here, not that it should be too surprising, is that Nintendo intends on putting out more new titles for Nintendo Switch 1. It's not just the titles you see here. This is not the end of Switch 1 support. And I find this interesting because it reminds me of a rumor from Nash Weedle that we've talked about already, how he's been talking about how there will apparently be one big surprise title launching this year for Switch 2, one announcement for a major game for 2026 for Switch 2, and then 2 Switch 1 game announcements, one for next year, one for this year. So we're getting a Switch 1 and Switch 2 announcement for this year, and a Switch 1 and Switch 2 announcement for next year, according to this rumor from Nash Weedle. Now a reminder that Nash Weedle has been getting a lot right correctly. The Metroid Prime 4 mouse controls, Assassin's Creed Shadows leak apparently seems to have come true, Elden Ring Special Edition we now know as Tarnished Edition, Donkey Kong Bonanza as opposed to 3D Mario and Nintendo Direct. These are all recent leaks from Nash Weedle that have seemingly been confirmed. And so as they consider Nintendo's 2025 lineup, I think it's pretty reasonable to expect at least one more Switch 1 game announcement and at least one more big Switch 2 game announcement. As I said, looking at what they have so far, it makes sense to think that they need at least one more big Switch 2 exclusive going into the holidays. And because I think some people will point this out, Nashville did say at an earlier time that the surprise title is a big deal title. As you see here in this thread here, yes, but there's something unannounced from Nintendo that is being released this year and will be a major surprise. So not a small thing according to Nash Weedle, which again makes sense. We need another big release that is Switch 2 exclusive for these holidays. And so with all this information considered, let's try and put together how the Switch 2 lineup is going to go in terms of published Nintendo releases. So we know that Mario Kart World is coming out in June, right? As is Welcome Tour. Welcome Tour is a digital-only release. You can get that on the eShop for, I think, $10 USD. Also, Breath of the Wild Switch 2 Edition and Tears of the Kingdom Switch 2 Edition will be available day one as well. However, in July, we know we are getting Donkey Kong Bonanza, and also we are getting Mario Party Jamboree Switch 2 Edition. So we are seeing a little bit of a pattern here where you get one major release, maybe something smaller, and then you get the Switch 2 Edition, right? So in July, it's not the launch of the console, so it's going to be a little bit lighter, but we have one major Switch 2 exclusive and then a Switch 2 Edition. Which I find interesting because we also know that we are getting Kirby and the Forgotten Land plus Star-Crossed World Switch 2 Edition in late August. This is a Switch 2 Edition, and given this is the launch of their next big console, you would think they would have a little bit more than just one Switch 2 Edition for the month of August. Looking at how Nintendo handled things in 2017, they had major releases every single month, sometimes more than one major release per month. And so I think just a Switch 2 Edition is not enough, especially a Switch 2 Edition that's not a new game, but a game that came out a few years ago. If this was Metroid Prime 4 or Pokemon Legends ZA, I think you can make a better argument for that being just like the one big release for the month, but I definitely think there needs to be more here. Now we do know that Dragon Drive is supposed to come out this summer. They've told us summer, and well, June, July, those are summer months, as is August. September is a possibility for Dragon Drive because technically summer does trickle into September, but this is also the beginning of fall. I would say more likely Dragon Drive being also a digital only title, not a very big release. It's probably pretty easy to anticipate this coming out sooner than later, especially with it being a game that has such a huge focus on mouse controls. I would think they would really want to get something out like this very early. Plus, it's also speculated this game is very similar to ARMS. It's a multiplayer, very sporty kind of game, something that fits very well in the summer months, the more traditional summer months, including August, not September, once everyone's going back to school and all that stuff. So I think this makes a lot of sense in terms of expecting a release here. Now, the question is Drag and Drive and the Switch 2 edition of Kirby's Forgotten Land enough for the month of August? That's definitely lesser than these other 2 months here, so we'll come back to this. I think there's something going on here, but we shall see. Now, in the month of September, I've been feeling that Metroid Prime 4 could be coming out here, especially looking at Nintendo's recent financial briefing here and the data they've put out there. They are not qualifying Prime 4 as a late or winter or fall release, just a 2025 release, and we are getting updates on Prime 4 even on the Nintendo Today app. There was a Treehouse segment for it. It's not getting as much of a push as Mario Kart or Donkey Kong, which makes sense because it's not coming out in June or July, but once we get our big Switch to June Direct, then I would assume Prime 4 is going to get more of a focus, and so really I just think it's coming out a little bit later, not a lot later into the year. September really makes a lot of sense to me. August seems like probably too soon, because if we're already getting like a summer window for Drag and Drive and a specific release date in August 28th for Kirby's Forgotten Land Switch 2 edition, I would assume Prime 4 is probably a little bit beyond that, so that's why I think September is probably our safest bet here. But I want to point something out, because I took a look at some prior years where Nintendo gave us some release timings and the wording they used for these different games, and actually thinking on in retrospect when they actually came out. So back in 2017, Nintendo told us that Mario Odyssey was a winter 2017 release, which I find interesting because Mario Odyssey ended up coming out in October, which I would not call winter. I assume they ended up coming out a little bit later, and they were just erring on the safer side of things at this point in time. But then looking at what they said about the release timing for Pokemon Sword and Shield a few years later, they also said winter. But Pokemon Sword and Shield came out in November of 2019. So this also feels a little bit off to me. Of course, they also said here Animal Crossing will be coming out in 2019, that came out 2020. So I think we should just take into consideration here that these were estimates and there was definitely some flexibility to be had. But let's take a look at some other years here and their wording here. So in the case of the Pokemon Sword and Shield DLC, they anticipated that the Crown Tundra would release in fall of 2020. And it did. It released October of 2020. But they also said Pokemon Scarlet and Violet would be coming out late 2022, and it released in November of 2022. So I think this is interesting when we consider the release timing for Pokemon Legends ZA. It's possibly coming out in October. I still assume November, because we are seeing a late 2025 release timing, and we've seen most recently with Scarlet and Violet, they predicted a late 2022 release, and it came out in November of that year. And usually Pokemon games come out, the mainline ones from Game Freak come out in November. Possibly it may slide into October, that is possible, but I'll get back to the October time slot in a moment here. Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment might not even make it out this year, but if Nintendo truly accidentally shared when it would be coming out, I guess that would mean December, which to me makes a lot of sense. Now, Kirby Air Riders, all we know is it's coming out in 2025. We do not know when. I would say this is the kind of game that could come out in October or September, and it would be fine. Maybe even December is a possibility. We've seen Sakurai put out Smash Brothers in December, although that was Smash Brothers. So maybe you don't want to wait that late into the year. Maybe you want it to come out a little bit earlier, where it has a little bit less competition and more time to shine. So I'm going to predict that Kirby Air Riders comes out October or November, just because we've seen in prior years Nintendo put out several games during this period of time. So conceivably it could fit in either month here. Maybe it comes out even earlier, maybe September. But given that Kirby comes out August 28th, I don't know if they want to bunch up two Kirby games too soon to each other, too close to each other. So I'll say, actually I'll space them out a decent amount, and I'll say that Kirby alongside Pokemon come out in November. This is a Switch 1 game, right, that has a Switch 2 edition, so maybe having an actual Switch 2 game in the month of November will make a lot of sense. I would not be surprised if, when it comes to Pokemon, there aren't going to be that many people that will buy a Switch 2 specifically for the Switch 2 edition of Pokemon Legends ZA. Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, on the other hand, though, I have a feeling more people prefer to play the Switch 2 version as opposed to the Switch 1 version. So if there is a month that Nintendo has to pick a Switch 2 exclusive to come out alongside a big new Switch 2 edition game, I would argue that it might make more sense in the month of November because of Pokemon. Now, as you see here, I have this little Luigi thing. I've been theorizing that the big surprise title for this year is Luigi's Mansion 4. If you're curious on my thoughts on that, I have a whole video that I put out recently. I'll put in the iCard here so you can check it out. It may not be Luigi, just consider this to be the placeholder for the big surprise Switch 2 game. Even if you don't believe the rumors, it makes sense for there to be at least one more big Switch 2 exclusive, and usually Nintendo puts out these big exclusives in the month of October. Maybe it's 3D Mario, maybe it's something else. So here I have that coming out in October as a big Switch 2 game before November, where we usually see Pokemon. Now you see here I have Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. This would be the Switch 1 game. When does this come out? Possibly October as well. Maybe that could happen. Like I said, we've seen the October and November months get an increased amount of games, so maybe this is when that happens. And thinking about it, I could see a scenario where, yeah, they put out a big Switch 1 and Switch 2 title in the month of October, and a Switch 1 and Switch 2 title for the month of November. That makes the most sense to me. And what's also interesting about this is that if things go the way I'm sort of suggesting here, that gives the entire month of September to Prime 4, where it has the biggest focus. Not to mention, if they announce nothing more for August, it's just Dragon Drive and Kirby Switch 2 Edition, which means more fans might be even more inclined to pick up something bigger in the month of September. Now you might look at this window here and think, well, maybe they need something else major to come out during this period of time. And I think it should be noted that just because we have a rumor for one more big Switch 2 title and one more big Switch 1 title for this year, doesn't mean there won't be more. That is a rumor. There could be more. This is the launch year for Switch 2, so they may want to have an even more densely packed lineup for this year. We shall see. But currently, as things stand, I feel like this is my best possible prediction for how things will go. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.